I'm very pleased to be here. It's my first visit to Morocco, and indeed really my first visit to Africa. This meeting looks like it has an interesting and promising schedule, and I'm looking forward to it. Let's see if I can, all right. This talk is, has two themes. One is some results that are very relevant to policy, and the other is some methodological comments and suggestions. So this may mean that half the audience is falling asleep during each half of the talk, but I'll try to give you, try to keep it as interesting as I can. This is joint work with a student of mine, Dake Lee, who is at this point so far the sole author of the methodological appendix, which is completely written. The rest of the paper isn't written yet. This is a paper using not just time series methods, but panel data methods to look at the relationship between growth of credit and growth of income. This is a topic that's received a lot of interest recently. There has been, because there was rapid credit growth before the crash of 2009, there's been a lot of ex post interest in whether we can see from the historical record that there is a pattern in which credit growth precedes crashes or low growth in GDP. But we have to remember that credit growth and income growth are generally positively correlated. Credit grows when income grows. In fact, it's an empirical regularity that the aggregate amount of credit, that is not netted out, but just adding up loans across the private sector, credit growth grows more than in proportion to income. Richer countries have higher ratios of credit to GDP than poorer countries. Over time, as countries get richer, they tend to have higher ratios of credit to GDP. And we can understand why this should be true on the basis of ordinary economic reasoning. Credit is likely to grow when investors see profitable opportunities that they would like to exploit. When investors see profitable opportunities, they may or may not be correct about whether these new opportunities are going to pay off. So even if they're generally right and credit expansion precedes growth, there can be situations where an initial enthusiasm for a new technology or a new investment opportunity turns out to have been over-optimistic, and so when there may be output growth followed by contraction. But across countries and across time, if you just do scatter plots, you'll see that credit and GDP are positively related. Indeed, there's a literature of kitchen sink economic growth regressions in which people try to explain growth across countries by looking at various characteristics of the country. And one of the variables that's commonly used there is one that's called financial depth, which is exactly the ratio of credit to GDP. It's generally expected that in these regressions, what you will find that countries that have a high ratio of credit to GDP tend to grow faster because this is an indication of a more sophisticated financial system. But of course, credit growth does sometimes precede output decline, and the most obvious example of this is the 2008-9 Great Recession, which was in the United States preceded, and indeed internationally preceded by great expansion in credit. And there's been a great deal of formal and informal empirical analysis trying to uncover a negative predictive relationship between credit growth and future output growth since 2009. But if we're to have any hope of quantitatively pinning down this negative effect of credit growth on GDP growth, there have to be at least two causal channels operating, because we know that the reduced form relationship, the simple relationship in long time series or across countries, is that high ratios of credit to GDP go with high income. So it can't be true that high ratios of credit to GDP are always bad, that expansion in credit is always a predictor of bad things in the future. One needs to have a model and a way of looking at the data that will extract two separate causal channels if one has any hope of doing this study right. So there have been other people who have looked at models of credit and growth. A well-known paper on this subject is by my colleague Atif Mian, and along with Sufi and Emil Werner. Mian's office is next door to mine at Princeton. They look at a small vector autoregression with GDP and two measures of credit, household credit and business credit. And like this paper, they use an international panel data framework. In other words, they look across time and across countries and try to use their time series model, which is fit as a common model across countries, to see if they can uncover a relationship between credit growth and income growth. And they do, as I'll summarize in a minute, they do find some indication of a negative relationship between later output growth and current credit growth. There's a paper that I've written jointly with Marcus Brunnermeier, Darius Palea, and Karthik Sastry. Palea is at Rutgers, Brunnermeier is my colleague at Princeton, and Karthik is an MIT graduate student. We've used monthly US data and a 10-variable structural vector autoregression that includes credit spreads, credit aggregates, and interest rates in our system. Mian, Sufi, and Werner do not use interest rates in their system, and that's critical, I think, to why it's harder to interpret their results than ours. Both these papers find that there is a shock, a kind of disturbance to the economy that produces both an initial rise in GDP and credit aggregates and a later decline in GDP. However, in both these papers, the initial rise and decline combined do not produce a clear overall negative effect. That is, there's an initial rise in GDP growth after the credit expansion. There's a decline in GDP growth after, but if you integrate over that time path, you get something that's insignificantly different from zero. In other words, the decline in GDP is only about enough to offset the initial growth rather than pushing GDP into negative territory. Also, in both these papers, little of the variance in GDP is explained by this shock. That is, there is this relationship, but most of the variation in GDP is accounted for by other sources of disturbance, and those other sources of disturbance generally produce movements in the same direction of credit and GDP. So what does this paper do that these previous papers haven't done? It includes interest rates. It's a relatively large structural vector autoregression like the monthly data US paper with Brunemeyer, Paley, and Sastry. Unlike that paper, it adds real estate prices, but we have not yet included spreads, partly because that would raise methodological problems we haven't solved yet. This paper uses quarterly data on an international panel like Mian-Soufi and Werner. So here's a preview of the substantive results. Again, like these previous papers, we find that there is a shock that it produces an immediate jump in credit, and in this paper, it's a jump in this shock is associated with an upward jump in real estate prices. There's a brief but sharp rise in GDP growth, followed after about 2 years by a decline in GDP growth. This shock that produces the rise and decline accounts for a small part of overall GDP growth variance in most countries, as in the previous papers. The net long-term effect, as in the previous papers, of the initial rise and later fall in GDP growth is, well, in this paper, it turns out to be positive. I'm not sure how well that will hold up as we try variance on the model. All the other shocks in the model produce either positive co-movement or no effect at all on credit aggregate and GDP. So here's the model. For those of you who are technical econometricians, this may be very familiar. It's a structural vector autoregression. Y is the vector of variables in the model. It's indexed by I, which indexes countries, and T, which indexes quarters in time. We have it says something indicates the U.S. variables we are conditioning on. We have, oh, I see, we have YIT and YIT tilde. I couldn't see the tilde on this screen. The YIT is the vector of variables that's present in all the countries and indexed by I. The Y tilde is a vector of U.S. variables. In principle, a vector. In the results I'll show you today, we've just used a single variable, the U.S. Policy interest rate, the federal funds rate. So this is a structural vector autoregression in which each country has the same, is assumed to have the same dynamics. Each country is presumed to react to the U.S. interest rate. So the U.S. is not in the list of countries indexed by I. It's taken as exogenous. And we separately estimate a model for Y tilde, the U.S. interest rate. So the shocks UIT are treated as normally distributed with zero mean, and what's important is that their covariance matrix, omega t, is diagonal and varies across countries. The variation across countries in the size of the shocks is what we use to identify or to separate variation into different sources. And in particular, one source of variation is a shock that looks like what we think of as a monetary policy disturbance. But in arriving at this identification and at this way of mapping the historical data into distinct sources of stochastic variation, we've had to make no assumptions except that as we go across countries, the relative sizes of these shocks change. So that in order for our identification scheme to work, it must be true that in some countries, monetary policy disturbances are relatively more important than in other countries, for example. And our estimates verify this assumption. That is, we find clear differences across countries in the relative sizes of disturbances. So that the assumption that the variation in these sources of disturbance change across countries, sometimes people trying to criticize this type of work question the assumption that the variances change, but there's really little reason to question that. The assumption that is questionable, that's very strong, and in fact clearly incorrect, at best only an approximation, is that A of L, the dynamics, are unchanged across countries. We allow countries to differ in their constant terms, so their relative sizes can vary. All the variables are logarithmic, so once we take out the constant terms, the relative, we're dealing with essentially percentage changes in the economic variables, and we're insisting that they have, that the dynamics be the same in every country, but that sources of disturbance have different relative sizes in different countries. So we can explain different patterns of correlation and different sizes of variances in variables across countries, but we explain them by different sizes of these fundamental sources of disturbance. This kind of identification is called identification through heteroscedasticity. In economics, it was perhaps first used by Roberto Rigobon some years ago. So we have quarterly data on 20 countries over a time span that ends in 2013 second quarter. We should expand the time series coverage, and will. The initial dates vary across countries because of data availability. In some countries, the time series are very short. As I'll explain, the methodology we use is not sensitive to the fact that some countries have very few observations. We include the euro area as one country from 1999 onwards. We would include, and may yet include, individual euro area countries before 1997-3 as separate countries, but we really wanted to use this real estate price time series, and the source we used did not have the real estate price series for the euro area countries other than Italy. So that's the only one that enters separately for now. Here are the country names. This is just to give you a rough idea of our coverage. Some of these are small countries, some of these are big countries, some are rich countries, some are poor countries. Of course, the results are dominated by the countries which have the longest time series, and they tend to be the biggest and richest countries. The variables we use are real estate price, real GDP, a short-term interest rate, commodity price index, GDP deflator as a general price index, credit, which we proxy by the BIS aggregate household credit index. In their notation, it's the AHA series. And the U.S. federal funds rate, which we treat as an exogenous variable. So how do we estimate this model? In panel data, it's well known that in dynamic models, if one has a common model across countries, if one just estimates vector autoregression by ordinary least squares, the results are not consistent as n, the number of countries, goes to infinity. Or another way to put it is that because the standard OLS estimation of a vector autoregression, conditions on the initial conditions And those initial conditions are related to the constant terms, which are CI in this setup, across countries. The assumption that the initial conditions and the constant term are independent, which is implicit in the standard way of estimating a vector order regression by just doing least squares, is incorrect. And because it's incorrect, it leads to inconsistency in estimation if you have, or another way to put it is poor estimates if you have short time series and a large number of countries. Now here we have, for some countries, a decent number of time series observations, but we only have 30 countries, or 20 countries, so it's not a huge number of countries. And about half the countries have quite short time series. So we really don't have large N or large T. But by modeling the dependence of CI on yi0 explicitly, so we're treating the CIs as random variables, and that immediately means we're using a Bayesian approach to inference. We're not making a sharp distinction between parameters, which are non-stochastic, data, which are stochastic. We're using an approach to inference that treats all unobserved variables or parameters as random and uses the data to update our beliefs about those parameters. In dynamic panels, a Bayesian approach is very natural. Those of you who have studied panel or even a large cross-section with many group estimation methods know that you have to, as you enter that area of econometric methodology, if you want to maintain a frequentist perspective, one has to become a bit schizophrenic. One talks about sometimes random effects models and sometimes fixed effects models. The same object can be labeled CI or NUI. CI meaning it's treated as a fixed parameter. NUI means it's treated as a random variable. From a Bayesian perspective, there's no difference between the Greek letters and the Roman letters. The fact that CI is a random variable is completely natural. And in that framework, one can treat the conditional distribution of CI given yi0 as a part of the model that needs to be parameterized and has parameters that need to be estimated. And if one does that, one gets a perfectly internally consistent small sample theory of inference for the panel data. You don't have to be assuming either N or T is large. Though, of course, you are relying on the assumption of normality for getting the small sample interpretation of the results. So that's what we're doing. And let's see, do I give? Yeah, at the bottom here. So I've already said a good deal of what's on this slide. A lot of applied work on panel data uses instrumental variables in an approach originated by Arellano and Bond. Those instrumental variable methods can be extremely inefficient, and they don't lead to a complete model of the variation in the data. The advantage of the approach we're taking here is we postulate a model for all the observed data and use it all efficiently. The fact that you can get rid of the inconsistency or the problem of ignoring CI, yi0 dependence by taking a likelihood-based, usually Bayesian approach, it's fairly widely recognized by people in the field, but I think applied people need to learn that this really is possible and works. There's a beautiful paper by Laura Liu that applies this approach to modeling firm data, and it's a good place to both understand why the approach works and to see it actually applied to real data. So how do we estimate this system? Unrestricted vector autoregressions with constant covariance matrices can be estimated by just, if you're estimating, as Mian-Soufriverny did, reduced form vector autoregressions across countries, you can just stack up the data for the countries and proceed. That approach doesn't work with structural vector autoregressions. Structural vector autoregressions with time varying, or in this case, variances varying across countries, can be estimated with a common filter, but a common filter is much less efficient than recognizing that it's possible to transform the system into a large stacked generalized least square system, and that's what we have done. We've also used Bayesian priors, part of which is this model for the conditional distribution of the constants given the initial conditions yi naught. And the entire prior that we can use can be implemented with dummy observations, which is another way of saying it's a conjugate prior in the technical language of Bayesian inference. And the appendix to the paper explains exactly how we did this. So now I'll discuss the impulse responses. So this is a system with, can't remember now, is it 7 variables, I think? So we have an array of impulse responses, 7 shocks, 7 variables. Displaying and discussing the patterns of responses in this system is a challenge, and I hope I'm going to be able to do it on this computer. We'll see. The identification in this paper, unlike the one that I did with Brunnermeier, Paley, and Sastry in the US, here the residuals, the reduced form residuals are almost uncorrelated across variables, so that identification through heteroscedasticity, as we've done here, is almost trivial. You end up with a system that's very similar to what you would get from a reduced form vector autoregression. When you identify through heteroscedasticity, as we've done here, there are no names on the shocks. So the identification only separates variation into distinct, orthogonal, unrelated sources. It doesn't tell you what each source represents. To decide what each source represents, you have to look at the impulse responses and ask if you know what that shock must be. Now, we're interested mainly in the monetary policy shock, and as you'll see, it's pretty clear which shock is the monetary policy shock when we show our results. We're also interested in shocks that originate in the financial system, and we expect that to be indexed by shocks that either move real estate prices initially or move credit growth initially. So the first shock, I'll show you in a minute these plots, but it may help to know what to look for. So I'll first go through a verbal description. The first shock, which moves the real estate prices instantly, also produces a statistically significant rise and then fall in real GDP and an expansion in credit. And this fits the story of a housing-based credit boom followed by contraction. However, the shock also increases inflation and raises interest rates, which consistent with what I found with my co-authors in the 2018 paper, suggests that the slowing of growth followed by the shock can be explained by the endogenous monetary policy reaction to the inflation or to the credit growth itself. But this pattern appears in both papers, one with monthly U.S. data, one with no U.S. data at all, only international data. The pattern is there's a shock that produces a rise in credit followed by slowing GDP growth, and it looks as if the slowing in GDP growth is exactly what you would expect from the interest rate rise that is produced in response to the inflation that accompanies the credit growth. The third shock on the plots we'll look at fits the usual sign restrictions used to identify a monetary policy shock, though the response of prices itself is weak. The U.S. interest rate shock has effects that have much wider error bands than the others, as you'll see. And that's because the other shocks are estimated from many countries, and this results in a large data set and small standard errors, whereas the U.S. shocks dynamics are estimated from a single time series and hence have more uncertainty and thus wider error bands. That may suggest, and I think correctly, that the error bands on the non-U.S. shocks are unrealistically tight, and I'll comment on that later. The U.S. shock produces a sustained rise in the U.S. short rate, and its effects on the other countries are mainly expansionary rather than contractionary, which surprised us. There's two possible explanations. One is that the response of domestic interest rates to the foreign interest rate rise is less than half of the U.S. interest rate rise. So the result is the U.S. interest rate rises, the domestic interest rate rises, but by less. So the result may be a devaluation, and that could be expansionary. Another possibility is that the current model's use of a one-variable autoregression and interest rates alone may fail to identify a monetary contraction, and the result may be that that if we use a more sophisticated model for the U.S. time series, that we might indeed find that monetary policy induced rises in the interest rates do have contractionary effects on other countries. So now what I'm hoping to do here is to expand this. Yes, that works, good. Now you can look for yourself and verify what I've just told you. Column 1 is the first shock. Row 1 is the response to the various shocks of real estate prices, and et cetera. Each row corresponds to the responses of a particular variable to each of the 7 shocks. The black line is the central or median response. The green lines represent 90% posterior probability bands. The red lines 68% bands. So that first shock raises real estate prices substantially. It makes real GDP go up by a statistically significant amount, and after these plots cover about, I believe, 10 years of response. So you can see that it takes almost 2 years for the response of GDP to peak, and then there's an estimated decline in GDP growth. You can see that commodity prices not sure how I can get this to go up and down. There. The deflator is the last row. That's the ordinary GDP deflator price index. You can see that goes up in response to this real estate price shock, and results in R, the interest rate, the third row, going up also. And if we look at the third column, the monetary policy shock, we can see that it's unsurprising that GDP growth declines after the interest rate rise in the first shock. The third column is what we interpret as a monetary policy shock. Interest rates rise, that's third row, third column. That shock is the main source of variation in the interest rates, the monetary policy shock. The rise in the interest rate produces, in the first row, a decline in real estate prices, a decline in real GDP, a decline in commodity prices, a weak response of the general price index. There's a little bit, possibly even statistically significant, initial rise in the deflator, but then very quickly it becomes statistically and significantly different from zero. But you can see that the monetary policy shock, the rise in interest rates, produces a decline in GDP growth, a decline in the interest in real estate prices, and so that lets us interpret the interest rate rise after the first shock as a monetary policy response that produces the later slow GDP growth. The last column is the responses to the U.S. Interest rate, and you can see that the domestic interest rate, that is the third row, responds positively to the U.S. interest rate, but trying to remember how I got it to go down. Well, I guess you can take my word for it that the response of the U.S. interest rate to its own shock is larger in absolute terms than the response of the domestic interest rate. Even though, using this, yeah. So actually you can see now in the last row there, the response of the U.S. interest rate shock moves the U.S. interest rate up by a full percentage point, and it raises the domestic interest rate up by only about a half percentage point. So that may explain why the U.S. interest rate shock turns out to be basically expansionary here, that it that the effect on GDP is positive rather than negative. So those are the results, and they confirm results with other data sets, with other approaches to identification. They contrast with the results found, for example, by Schulerick and Taylor, a widely cited paper in the American Economic Review. And there are many others that find negative relationships between credit expansion and future GDP growth. They are mainly based on single equation methods. Schulerick and Taylor do an elaborate pre-processing of the data. They don't look for a general nonlinear relationship between credit expansion and GDP growth. They convert measures of GDP growth into a 0-1 variable that is 1 when you're in a crisis. And then they look at whether credit growth predicts crises. Now, if you're sure that the relationship is very nonlinear and has this form, that may be convincing, but they are in effect looking for only one direction of causation, and they have to be confident that their method of filtering the data gets rid of the other directions of causation in an appropriate way. We have, not in the paper with Bernemeyer, Sastry, and Paglia, we do some checking for nonlinearities in this model. We find no evidence that we're missing anything by not looking at nonlinearities. This, from the point of view of a policymaker, this suggests caution in trying to incorporate credit growth in the policy reaction function. That is, one should not be led into contractionary monetary policy in response to every increase in credit growth. Credit growth may be useful in predicting inflation and output, and to the extent it is, the ordinary policy reaction function to projected output and inflation is appropriate. It is appropriate, if this model is correct, it is perfectly appropriate that the monetary policy responds with contraction to this first shock, because this contraction produces inflation, and most monetary authorities are committed to controlling inflation. They should try to dampen the inflation associated with the shock. In the paper with monthly US data, we actually estimate what would happen in response to a credit shock that produces future low GDP growth if we suppress the monetary policy reaction, which we can do, and we actually could do in this model. And as you might expect, what happens is if you suppress the monetary policy reaction, there is no decline in GDP growth. There is no decline in inflation either, though. Inflation, instead of flattening out as it does here, continues to grow. So the message is that the monetary policy contraction in reaction to this particular kind of credit expansion is reasonable, but it can be explained in terms of a reaction to inflation. When it does, the other sources of variation in credit are much more important than this one. If you look at the credit variable, see if I can get down to that again. Well, oh, I can do it this way. Okay. Okay. There we go. The credit variable, you'll see as you look across that row that the most important sources of variation in credit, these graphs are scaled so that their relative sizes tells you how important the various sources of variation are. The most important source of variation in credit is the credit shock itself. That is, but the second most is the second column. In the second column, GDP and credit are going in the same direction. The credit growth shock itself produces GDP and credit growth going in the same direction. So a policy that always responds to credit growth with contraction would be suppressing perfectly reasonable GDP growth not associated with inflation, and it's hard to see why that would be a good idea. In order to isolate the sources of credit growth that are problematic, one needs a multi-equation model, maybe not this one, but possibly a DSGE, but you need a model that can explicitly account for why it is that most credit growth is positively associated with future GDP growth, even though there are certain kinds of shocks that predict later, about 3 years later, negative GDP growth. How am I doing on time? So I think I won't go through the residual. I guess I have a little time. I want to leave some time for questions. I will show you a few time series plots of residuals. So just to give you an idea of what variation is left out when we try to use this model to explain the data. The residuals don't show clear patterns of serial dependence. That is, they look mostly like IID zero mean shocks, which is encouraging because that suggests that we haven't missed too much by insisting on the same dynamics across countries. That we've insisted on the same dynamics across countries. It could be that the countries are so different that we can't capture the time series regularities and we see residuals that have a lot of serial correlation. We don't see that. The residuals for the dummy observations are small, indicating that our prior is loose. That is, the dummy observations corresponding to the prior, when their residuals are large, it means that the prior is having a lot of influence on your estimates. You'll see that they're in almost every case extremely small, meaning that our prior is not dominating the results. When we look at cross-country correlations of shocks, they're mostly not very big, but there are a few cases, and perhaps and particularly for the European Union and the UK, where the correlation of shocks across countries is rather large, and that's a problem for our approach. One could say, well, there's correlation across residuals. Let's account for that by trying to remember a name for clustering across, within countries or within time periods, which is what Mian and Sufi do. But clustering within time series is allowing for arbitrary patterns of correlation across countries in these shocks, and it undermines the interpretation of the shocks we have in mind. We want to interpret these shocks as country-specific sources of variation. Once we say they're correlated across countries, what does it mean to have a monetary policy shock in the EU if that monetary policy shock in the EU is strongly correlated with other shocks in other countries? It means we've missed some variation we should be capturing. So we see these residuals as a challenge to us to better model international sources of variation. That's why we're looking into using a more complicated US model. We're also thinking about the possibility of allowing for low-dimensional, maybe one-dimensional international shock that's distinct from the country-specific shocks. And I mentioned before that the current error bands are unrealistically tight. This is a generic problem I see in many papers, actually most often in big cross-section papers in labor economics. We approach data sets, which are now much bigger than we used to be using 20, 30 years ago, with the same kinds of tools that we developed 20 and 30 years ago. Linear models, linear IV models, small vector order regressions. But when we have these large data sets, the parameter estimates in our models tend to emerge as very sharply estimated with very small error bands. That's happening here. We've got these 20 countries to estimate a relatively small number of parameters in our A of L dynamics. And because this model is relatively simple, by using all this cross-country variation, we get very sharp estimates. But when we look at those estimates, they appear the error bands appear too sharp compared to what we really believe about how much we know about these responses. And that's because the model is too simple. We know that though we've assumed the dynamics are the same across countries, they can't possibly be exactly the same across countries. So could we allow for, I think I have a separate, I've mentioned using a US model with more variables. We could allow for more variation across countries in the lagged part of the A of L operator. Doing that is relatively straightforward in a Bayesian context. Straightforward meaning I know how to write down the equations. It's actually probably 3 or 4 months at least of programming effort to get it to be done properly. We also here have identified the shocks entirely by cross-country variation in the relative sizes of the structural shocks. The US monthly data model I mentioned identifies the shocks entirely by across-time variation within the US. It's kind of inconsistent of us to be using cross-country variation only in this paper and cross-time variation only in the other paper. In principle, we should have variation both across time and across countries. Again, that's something that's relatively straightforward to implement in a Bayesian context, but it's quite a bit of work to actually do it. The general methodological message is in too much of our work, particularly in labor economics, when I look at applied labor, there's a tendency to be satisfied with a linear model in which every coefficient has 3 stars by it, meaning it's estimated so tightly that random variation, that uncertainty about the coefficients is essentially gone. When we get initial results like that, we should be recognizing that this is telling us that our model, we have plenty of room to estimate a more realistic model that allows for non-linearity, to look at saturating the model with interactions. Of course, making the model more complicated makes it harder to interpret, but I'd argue it's also hard to interpret a model that we know is not true, where we've imposed linearity, we've imposed lack of interaction of right-hand side variables out of just because we're following the existing literature, and yet we know that we really could explore these dimensions of additional complication in the model. I guess one other complication is we could follow my paper with Jean in 2006 and estimate time variation, the pattern of variation across countries and time in the shocks. We've assumed each country has its own relative size of shocks. It's possible you could group countries into similar groups. That would give us room for more sophisticated modeling. So that's the methodological conclusions. The substantive conclusions, which I've already mentioned, I'm just going to recap them here. Credit expansions accompanied by real estate price inflation do predict future low GDP growth, but also predict immediate high GDP growth, and the low growth seems to be a response to ordinary anti-inflationary monetary policy. Use of identification through heteroscedasticity to identify monetary policy responses yields results similar to other approaches and other data sets in the literature. This is one more example of the robustness of our structural VAR approaches, of which there are many, to estimating the response of the economy to monetary policy-induced interest rate changes. So I think that's it. I guess I promised I would show you a couple of plots of residuals. This is just as one example. The dotted line is the vertical dotted line is the dividing line between real data and dummy observations. So you can see the size of the shocks drops dramatically as we go from real data to the dummy observations. That's showing the prior is weak. And then looking at the time series, you can see by eye that there, for example, the real estate price, the upper left one there, you can see in the early part of the sample, it appears there is some serial correlation there that we've missed with this common dynamics. But mostly the residuals show very little serial correlation. There's no clear low frequency variation in these. So with that, I'll close, and maybe we have time to accept questions from the audience. I guess we're officially supposed to be going to coffee in 10 minutes. So. Anybody have a question? Yes. Go ahead, speak up.
Good morning. Thank you so much for a very nice presentation and paper. My name is Angela from Yokohama National University, and it's an honor to meet you. So I just have a pretty generic question, which I'm not sure if you can infer from your study or maybe just get your thoughts on. But considering the variety of the levels of financial depth in the countries, for example, Japan is, say, over 95% financial inclusion vis-a-vis Mexico, maybe about 50%. Would you say that, as some studies have shown, that monetary policy effectiveness when the participation of the households in the formal financial sector is so low is not as effective? So would you say that in countries where the financial depth is low or financial inclusion is much lower, the effect of the monetary policy response to the increase in credit growth is not as negative and may not offset the positive effect of credit growth that initially was there because of that growth? And by that line of reasoning, then saying that countries that have lower financial inclusion or depth the monetary authorities have some leeway, so to speak, to kind of let that credit growth continue without responding vis-a-vis more advanced countries like the UK or the US, in which case they are more likely to have a crisis because of that participation. Thank you.
That's a good question. There's no doubt that when we move from rich countries where almost everybody has a checking account to countries where a small part of the population does, that the channels for influence of monetary policy are different, and the distributional impact of monetary policy actions is different. Now, I think that in every kind of country, what this paper suggests, and this is it seems to me is good common sense, is that it's a mistake to think of credit growth as a one-dimensional object which ought to have a particular coefficient in the monetary policy reaction. There can be different kinds of credit expansion. In the US, we learned ex post that there was credit expansion that created big risks of wide-scale default. What the mechanism by which credit expansion produces negative effects is that that individual actors in the financial sector and firms, it varies across countries who's taking the risks, but they find it individually optimal to take risks that when aggregated turn out to be socially non-optimal. So the problem of the central bank is to get enough data to understand what kind of credit expansion is occurring. You don't want, we learned long ago, we should have learned that you don't want institutions in your country, either banks or private firms, borrowing in dollars and lending in domestic currency if the exchange rate is volatile. But there are many other kinds of imbalances that can turn out to have aggregate effects. Bankruptcies are very disruptive if they occur in a large scale, because the definition of a bankruptcy is a situation where the explicit contract that describes what each party to the contract is going to do can't be delivered. And what happens instead is indeterminate, and it takes a long time to resolve it, and that's what creates the big negative effects of wide-scale bankruptcies. So the problem is to avoid credit expansion that carries a risk of wide-scale default or bankruptcy. And it's a very difficult problem, but qualitatively, it's the same kind of problem in advanced and less advanced countries. In less advanced countries, there's less data overall. In the US, you would have thought there's so much data that the Federal Reserve has. How could they have missed this? But they did. The issue is the ratio between how much data the system has to how big and complicated the system that they have to monitor is. This guy is one ahead of you. I'll get to you next.
Thank you very much, Professor Sims, for your interesting presentation. My name is Abdul Nasser Hatami. I am from UAE University. I have just a question. As you know, in financial markets, people tend to react to more to negative shocks than positive ones. So my question is it possible or operational to allow for some form of asymmetry in your model to generate the shocks? Thank you.
That's another good question. We haven't tried to look for asymmetry in this paper yet, at least. In the paper with Bernard, Pelia, and Sastry, we did look for asymmetry. Now, the space of possible nonlinearities is huge. We just explored a few variations. We couldn't find any, and what we did, we looked at using growth rate of credit over a span of time and breaking it up into separate effects of small and large growth rates of credit, and found the data just didn't want to use that source of variation at all. It wanted to go straight back to using just ordinary growth rates. It didn't want to distinguish large and small. I think we did something with asymmetry of shocks also, but it's all in the context of this model. You might start from the ground up with, if you have a theoretical model that tells you more about the structure of nonlinearity that you're interested in. So it's certainly possible, I think even plausible, that there are nonlinearities there that this framework doesn't pick up. But they can't be the main source of variation. We're capturing almost everything that's going on here. It's unlikely that there is a big source of variation that we would find if we use a more nonlinear model. Mark?
Well, you very rightly pointed out the fact that oversimplified parametric models in the big data context were leading to misleadingly precise estimation. This plays in favor of model-free and non-parametric approaches, and I remember pioneering papers by Sims and Sargent on the so-called approximate factor models. So those models are they are not really models. They are model-free, and they are non-parametric. And so did you think of using that type of approach in this context?
I actually don't like the term model-free as used as equivalent to non-parametric. When thinking about these issues in a Bayesian framework, I think of non-parametrics as estimation in infinite dimensional parameter spaces. So they're not really non-parametric, they've just got infinite dimensional parameters. And once you think about it that way, you realize that actually any kind of inference in infinite dimensional parameter spaces that is going to lead to measures of uncertainty, error bands, confidence sets, or posterior probability sets, has to add assumptions, regularity conditions, that shrink the parameter space drastically in a topological sense. And in particular, they have to shrink it in the same sense that sieve estimation or Bayesian estimation, in which one treats the parameter space as a countable union of finite dimensional parameter spaces. Those, of course, obviously shrink the parameter space. Those kinds of assumptions obviously shrink the parameter space drastically, but there's no way to avoid it if you want to end up creating meaningful confidence sets for your results. So this is kind of a philosophical answer. Of course, the real question is, what if I'm going to appeal to sieve estimation, or to which is the idea that you can get, quote, model-free estimates by promising to expand your model and make it more complex as you get additional data. I don't seem to have done that here. You can actually see in my paper with Brunemeyer, Paley, and Sastry, we actually have done that. We began with a Gaussian residual framework. We saw that there were 6 and 7 standard error residuals appearing frequently. We then, we could go part way to eliminating those large standard error results by allowing for time variation and variances, but not all the way. And so in the end, we used a t-distribution for our shocks. That added, in some sense, a large number of parameters, because from our estimation method, we were actually estimating a size of the variance of the normal shock for each observation. And even with the t-distributed shocks, there are still a few time periods in those US monthly data where the shocks are too big. So there's room for further expansion of the model. This is not what people think of as explicitly non-parametric. We could have been more explicit. In fact, one of the things we tried doing instead of t-distribution is a mixture of normals model for the residuals. If you use a mixture of normal model and choose the mixing distribution as a Dirichlet process, you get Bayesian non-parametrics, an explicitly infinite dimensional parameter space. In practice, that approach is not very different from using a finite mixture of normals as your model. We tried a low-dimensional mixture of normals for the residuals, and it didn't work quite as well from a likelihood perspective as the t-distribution. But you could imagine in other words, one way to think of it is the t-distribution is still symmetric. The other approach we used would have allowed for an asymmetry. We didn't find enough asymmetry for the likelihood to tell us to do that. But I don't have anything against explicitly non-parametric methods, so long as one doesn't claim that parametric methods are inherently are somehow discontinuously separate from non-parametric methods. I think of them as there being a continuum. And the lesson of non-parametric approaches to inference for practitioners who are using finite dimensional models is that you should always be asking, in what dimensions would it be reasonable to make this model more complicated? Can I check whether there is a substantial benefit in fit or in changed estimates of policy responses to making the model more complicated? So that's it.